Guild Wars is back, and last time we covered offense, so this time we will take a look at defense. Now before we go into actual team building, there are a couple of concepts we need to understand. As most of us know, Guild Wars defense is controlled by AI, and at times it can be seemingly random. But after several seasons of observations, we have narrowed down the skill priority flowchart. Now what I mean by that is that the AI will follow a seemingly set pattern of using skills within a certain order. So the highest priority skills are going to be buffs, and these will be used every turn if possible. Usually AoEs will come first, followed by your single targets. So if there is an AoE buff, great, it'll use an AoE buff. However, if there is a single target buff, such as a Gotha rank up, this has its own priority in who it targets, and that will be whoever has the highest CC on the team. So out of 4 units, Gotha is going to rank up, let's say, Trader Meliodas if he has the highest CC on that team. Now, the only exception to this are buffs that have another condition before they are actually a buff. So Margaret's buff is a cleanse, as it removes debuffs before it is an actual buff. So conditionally, this will only work when there is a debuff down for her to cleanse, or if another buff that you have has some other condition, it will look for the condition before it will use the card. So next are stance skills. So you have Tarmiel, you have Festival Diane. They have their stances. These generally have a pretty high priority if the stancing unit has the highest CC on the team. So it's going to be spammed kind of similar to buffs, but if they don't have the highest CC, then it will fall down to a lower priority, just above attacks. So next are your debuffs. First we have non-offensive debuffs, such as Zeldris' Demonic Zone. As you can see, it doesn't actually do any damage. AoEs will come first, followed by single targets again. This pretty much follows on all of the skills. After your non-offensive debuffs, you have your offensive debuffs. So right here, like Loli's attack, it does actual damage. AoE and then single target again. Now the only exception to all the debuffs, they will only debuff once a turn, and if a debuff is already applied, then they won't use their skill. So that comes into play when Kyo is down and he's igniting everybody passively, or you have Arthur Relic down and that's already, again, passively handing out a debuff, then it will skip over the debuffs. So next are the actual attacks. The attacks first, the conditional attacks will come first. So, for example, Monspeeds, not necessarily Monspeed, but a weak point attack if the condition is met. So if somebody is debuffed, he is going to weak point attack whoever is debuffed. Now if the debuff, or if there is not an available debuffed enemy, then the weak point will have the lower priority. Next is pierce attacks, but they have a weird condition where if there is a Lilia and she is alive with her passive increasing pierce rate, then the pierce rate attacks will come next. So those are the main conditional attacks. After that are your standard AoE attacks that don't really follow any kind of conditions, and then your single target attacks that also don't really follow any kind of special conditions. Now the AI will focus type advantage, so blue, red, green, basically. That's who they will target, and that is essentially the current priority theory. If I got some things wrong, please let me know. It is a work in progress. Sometimes they do release patches that can change the AI. I know there was some issues with AI previously, but with all that said, when a hand comes down to skills with equal priority, it will play things out from right to left, which brings me to positioning. You'll generally want to position your main DPS units on the right, and then the least DPS / supportive units on the left. So the far right, that's usually the 4th slot on a normal team, is essentially going to be the 1st slot in Guild Wars. Like I said, it will play skills from right to left following that priority tree. So we want our strongest people to be dishing out their attacks first in the event that they can, hopefully kill somebody on the first turn. So we can take a look at some team building now. The first comp that I want to talk about is the debuff comp. The core of this is Kyo and Festival Zeldris. And the way this works is Kyo is going to be igniting all enemies with 2 ignite effects, and then if you have his relic, an additional 2 ignite effects on a random enemy. And then Zeldris' passive is going to increase allies' basic stats by 3% for every debuff applied. Now, since this is 4v4, you are going to hit Zeldris' cap on the first turn, especially if you have Kyo's Relic. So it's a 24% basic stat increase to all of your units. Now, the first slot is generally a DPS. We'll talk about that, or not DPS, a support slot. We'll talk about that first. The most common one is Fraudrin. Now, Fraudrin is only going to work if you do have him built out to a pretty good extent, as his passive does rely on out-CCing the enemy team. If he does out-CC, then he is going to lock Old Gauge for 2 turns, which means they cannot use the suicide comp into this, since they can't get any gauge. Now, if he does manage to stay alive long enough, his kit's not too bad, the extort's kind of nice, and then he does also have a buff cancel. That can also be helpful in a lot of scenarios. Now, if you can't use Fraudrin, don't want to, have him somewhere else. Another pretty good unit here is Gother. Now, Gother's main thing is that he does have a very strong debuff. Disables all buffs, disables skills which are rank 2 or higher, and then it's going to rank them down. And it just does that better at rank 2 and rank 3. So, this also means that they cannot bond this team very easily, since he's not going to be able to use his buff skill. Then on top of his first skill, it's a very situational ult gauge removal. Only works if he has 4 gauge, so it's not very reliable for actual ult removal. And then his passive kind of just increases his increases all stats, attack related stats, and max HP. So again, that kind of synergizes with trying to maximize our damage output, so he's not too bad in that slot. And then also probably one that's never used anymore, since we have so many more options now, is Green Easton. Her passive synergizes well with debuffs, since it does increase pierce rate, crit chance, and crit damage by 5%, up to 8 times for every debuff applied. So that is 40% increase in those stats. And then she also has a weak point attack, so that won't go to waste on this team either. And then the main DPS slot here, I would say the best unit you could use right now is probably Red Lilia. Red Lilia combined with her Relic is going to increase her basic stats further. 10% for every debuff up to 5, so we're looking at a 50% increase here, plus a 24% increase from Zeldris. She is going to be outputting a lot of damage. Her passive's not too shabby either. She does drop an additional debuff through corrosion based on the ult gauge of the enemies. She can restore some HP to the lowest health unit, and then her second skill at a rank 2 does have a form of ult control. If you don't have Lilia, don't have a Relic, don't want to build her, blah blah blah, the next pretty good unit I would say is Ragdian. In PvP, which is Guild Wars, she removes up to 3 buffs and debuffs on the enemy when the hero uses a skill. Increases damage dealt by 40% for each buff or debuff. So she's going to be hitting 3 very easily, especially with Kyo igniting every turn. She's not going to have a problem hitting the cap, and she's going to be increasing her own damage output pretty well there. Now, if you don't have her, the old school version in this slot was Monspeed. His commandment's not too bad, prevents ultimate move gauge from filling through skill use in PvP, so they do have to move skills. And if you combine that with Fraudrin, no one's going to be ulting for at least the first 3 to 4 turns. So again, that stops suicides pretty well. That's also, combined with Fraudrin, going to stop Bond pretty well. And then his skill set's not too bad. He's got a weak point attack, which will synergize well with our debuffs. And then whoever he attacks, as long as they are ignited, he is going to increase his own damage dealt by 100%. So if you don't have any of these units built, I would probably just kind of look at your box, see who could synergize well in the debuff comp that's centralized around that. So I would look for co-destruction attacks, which would be somebody like Iori or Red Estarossa, and then additional weak point attacks. So maybe Green Shin could work here, and whoever else has weak points. But that is the first team. This next team has stood the test of time. Since the early days of Grand Cross PvP, the Pierce team was very dominant. The team has since fell off in PvP, but in Guild Wars, where you do need 5 entire comps, Pierce works very well. Now, at the core, it is Blue Lilia. She needs to be here in order for the team to work. Increases all allies' Pierce rate by her own up to 50%, so you do need to make sure she is Pierce rated up in the top row of her gear. Now, she does have a very good heal. Her relic isn't really needed for this comp. And then her first skill is her attack skill. We want her on the far left because we don't want her spamming that. We really want her to get a merge on that because that is the team's form of ult control. The second slot is another support unit. This belongs to Red Arthur. Now, Red Arthur is very good, but you absolutely need to have his relic. Now, his relic does decrease enemies' defense-related stats by 20%, so they are naturally going to be squishier, allowing the Pierce team to have a higher damage output. Now, his other skill that is very good is his buff skill. So this is a single target buff, like we mentioned. This is going to target the highest CC unit on the team, which is going to belong to Meliodas. Now, there are two versions you can run. The old school version, which is the traditional Pierce version, Blue Demon Meliodas. He has a very strong Pierce attack on the first one, but his second skill is a very mediocre debuff skill, which is why we want to run Arthur Relic. He's not going to spam this on the first turn, so we don't have to worry about losing damage through spamming useless debuff skills. Now, you don't have to worry about that at all if you can run the new Meliodas. The new Meliodas has an Amplify on his first skill, so he is going to double effect, or not double effect. He's going to benefit very well, I should say, from Arthur's buff, and his second skill is a Pierce skill, so he's not going to be spamming useless debuffs, not to mention his debuff, or not debuff, his passive is a lot more relevant than Blue Demon Meliodas' passive. There's not going to be a lot of single target effects going down, just because the team is mostly Pierce attacks and AoEs, but if he does manage to get this off, the team is going to be pretty tanky. Now, the last slot goes to Rugal if you summon on Koff. If you didn't summon on KOF, I don't know why you wouldn't have done that. They have a lot of, probably the best collab. A lot of very relevant units. First attack, another Pierce attack. Makes sense why he's here. Second attack, mediocre debuff, not that great. He has a very strong passive, which is basically a revive to an extent. And his relic is just going to push his Pierce rate even further. Now, if you don't have Rugal, I know the slot went to King at some points in time. King is a very good unit in general. With his shield, he's going to be increasing damage output. He's going to be spamming his skills pretty often. They're very powerful power strike sever attacks. He's critting a lot. His damage is already very high. So he is a good replacement. If you don't have King, you'll probably just have to use a generic DPS that you have available, because the Pierce selection is terrible. I would not stick with it. Just have Meliodas and then Rugal if you can, and then if not, you know, King or whoever else you can fit here. Now, there is another variant to this comp. A comp that I like a little more focuses on stopping Bond. That is Tarmiel, Trader Melly, and Summer Merlin. So Meliodas is the same, Lily is the same, but Tarmiel passive and Summerlin relic go well together at decreasing the enemy's maximum HP. So Bond is going to have a much lower HP threshold, so by extension he is going to deal a lot less damage. Not to mention the team is primarily blue, so we are going to have type advantage into Bond. So this is my favorite variant of Pierce. This is what I like to run. Obviously, if you don't have Summer Merlin Relic, that's pretty much the caveat for this team. I would probably just run the standard Pierce version. The next thing we're going to look at is the Ludolin comp. Now, Ludo only works well, similar to Fraudrin, if you have him built out a lot. Now, his passive relies on him out-CCing the enemy team. Again, this is easier on defense since we do get a link, unlike offense, which is why you want to run these kind of units on defense. It's similar to Arthur Relic. He decreases defense-related stats by 40% instead of 20, and then 3 turns instead of 1 turn. So there is a very large window of vulnerability there for the enemy comp, and we are looking to just kind of deal as much damage as we can in that window. So Ludolin has a very strong power strike, not much to talk about there. She has an infect skill, which pairs well with her own relic, increases her attack by 20% when attacking a debuffed enemy. So if you have a relic, she can also be considered for the debuff team since she will benefit well from it there. And then her passive just makes sure that she can't be one shot. Now, the rightmost slot belongs to King. You could probably put really any other very high DPS unit here, but King is the best. This is pretty much a double festival team. His shield is going to increase damage output. You know, these three together are going to be, they're going to be pretty crazy. They're going to be popping off. The last slot is more of our support slot, so there's a couple units here we could do. Again, you could probably try running Festival Gother, who's on the first team, for the same reasons if you have him open. You could run Ram. Ram used to be used when this team was primarily an unknown team, since this increases unknown's basic stats by 20%. The version might be better off for the mono buffer if you are able to run a full unknown team. Ram is also a collab, so not a lot of people have her. The next one is going to be Athena. Now, Athena depletes 2 orbs from the ultimate move gauge of all enemies at the end of the turn if somebody on their team dies. So what this means is they can't run suicide. Again, another suicide stopping variation. So she's very useful to have. The less teams that you can suicide into is usually the better. Another potential unit you could use here is Droll. Droll also stops suicide to an extent. More so stops ult rush teams and not so much suicide because the way his effect works is it's a debuff. So the suicide comp runs Liz, and Liz is probably going to cleanse those debuffs off. So he's not too reliable to run for ult control if suicide is going to be a problem. If you want to stop something like Bond from moving skills and hitting ult, then that would be probably an option to use there. But that would be, this is kind of something I would try to look to run in this version. So this next comp is probably one of the strongest defense teams you can make. In fact, this team is so good that you could even use this on offense depending on your guild's needs and other people's compositions. This is the Goddess team, the Angels team, whatever you want to call it. There is a lot of synergy going on here. So we will start with our main DPS, Sariel. His damage output is extremely high. If he has type advantage, there's a good chance that he could one-shot a lot of green units. His passive increases Goddess allies' basic stats by the value equal to 20% of his own basic stats. So we're looking at about a 20% basic stat increase from Sariel. Now, Margaret's passive is going to increase Goddess allies' basic stats again by 8% every time an ally uses a stance or a buff skill. Now this team has 2. It has a Tarmiel stance and it has Margaret's own buff, which removes debuffs, increases damage dealt, and decreases damage taken. So coupling this with Tarm stance, a team is already very hard to get damaged, or very hard to deal damage to. Not to mention his first skill is a single target ult drain at rank 1, and then his ultimate does have a heal built in. Now if you are able to run Lizhawk, she is probably the best version here. This is only the real flexible slot, I would say. Pretty much everything else about this team is set in stone. But her first skill is an AoE rank down. Second skill decreases attack-related stats of all enemies. This is that debuff that is going to be applying on the first turn. So if this is paired with Tarm stance or even Margaret buff, not a lot of units are even going to be able to deal significant damage to the team. Not to mention, that stacked with her passive decreases all allies' damage taken from all target attacks by 10% for every goddess on the battlefield. So this is hitting the cap of 40. You're dealing a ton of damage and you're not going to be taking a whole lot yourself. Like I mentioned, these 3 aren't really flexible. These kind of have to be here. The only other unit that you can really put in the Lizhawk slot if you don't have her, since she was a limited unit, is Green Liz. And she's just kind of generically good. She can remove buffs, so if, you know, Meliodas is running Rampage, she can potentially put a stop to some of his attacks or attack output. And then she has a pretty good heal. And her ult is ult rush for the whole team. So that's not too bad, but like I said, this team is insanely good. You could potentially also actually run Goddess Liz if you aren't running her in attack. So this actually has a little more flexibility than before. The Goddessless version of this is also what's usually run, like I mentioned, on offense. So the team is just that good in general that you can pretty much put it wherever you want. Now, the Disaster team is probably one of the most difficult teams in the game to build because of how exclusive the units are. OC banners only come around once every couple of months, not to mention all of the team has a relic that you can build, so they can be very expensive, but if you are able to build them out, they are probably one of the most rounded comps in the game, next to the Angels. So starting with Christmasilia, her passive says whenever we use a single target skill, deals additional damage equal to 10% of their maximum HP, and then if it's an AoE, it's 7%. So she's going to allow us to deal percentage-based damage, which scales very well. She has a single target flood attack, which, similar to T1, we know hits very strong. Then she has an AoE dissolve, just like Gother's Pumpkin Bombs. Now, her relic is the exact same as Red Lilia. Its scales gives her additional stats based on everybody that has a debuff, which, at first glance, the team doesn't do a whole lot of debuffing, but is also why we need Mono in her relic. Now, every time she crits somebody, she's going to drop a corrosion attack. The only caveat with this is how often can Mono crit. Well, as long as the team is full disasters, she does have a cap of 30% of an all-stat increase as long as our allies are taking damage from a skill use. And then she has a Sever attack, which I'm not sure how many units there are that can not be critted from her Sever paired with the all-stat increase from her passive. Not to mention, if you are the mono buffer running this comp, you know, this team has a lot of potential. Again, her first attack is just a single target attack, so that's going to benefit both attacks benefiting from Lilia's passive. Now, Roxy is our third girl. Her passive increases her attack-related stats by 15% for each human other than herself. So we are looking at a 45% attack-related stat increase. She is just essentially a powerhouse for the team. Her relic doesn't really do anything, but it increases her basic stats further. Her first skill has a stance break at rank 1, and then the second skill is just a charge attack. Now, the last unit on the team is Queen Easton. Her first attack is a single target ult drain, and her second attack is a debuff. Oxidize decreases skill ranks and inflicts damage equal to 10% of max HP for every skill that was decreased. Again, we have more percentage-based damage, so that's very good. And then her passive decreases the amount of damage allies from the 7 catastrophes take by 3% for every orb on the battlefield. Not in the hero, not on the team, but for everybody, which is why she excels in Guild Wars, again, because it is 4v4. We do have additional ult gauges to scale from. And then her passive just heals her whenever she does remove some ult gauge. So, like I said, very well-rounded team. They have high damage, and they have the potential to take less damage, I guess. And then you also want to pair this with the artifact set, which we will talk about for everybody else on how to run artifacts, but specifically for the 7 catastrophes, they have their own all-stat increase artifact set. Another team that you can look into potentially running is the Mono Demon team. This is currently the single target variant with Cusack at the core to help keep bond teams in check. Now, if a critical strike does not occur when a demon uses a single target, inflict additional damage equal to 40% of the enemy's increased maximum HP in PvP. And we know how often Bond likes to increase his own HP. And then his first skill is how he is going to proc his passive, since Cleave does not activate critical strike damage. And then his second attack is a single target ult drain. His ultimate is very good, however, it only works when it's at rank 3. It's a power strike ult, but if it is 3 or higher, he does gain the Abyss effect, which scales very hard after rank 3. So the first slot is right now Trader Meliodas, if you're not using him anywhere else. However, he is not going to be proccing Cusack's passive, since he is all about critting, and he has that all-stat increase. He's just kind of there for a lot of damage. Now, the team is still primarily blue, so we do have that type advantage on Bon. And if you can't run Melee, T1 to stay with the blue typing advantage there is a very powerful single target, not demon, so we won't really be doing anything with Cusack passive. But he has a very strong kit as a whole. He's pretty much just a brute force DPS. Now the third unit is going to be Blue Dairy. She's got a nice taunt to keep the focus off of our main units. Her first skill does have a buff removal, which is a very nice skill to have. And then her passive increases basic stats by 10% up to 3 times, and then at the cap she does have an ult lock, so that's good. Very nice form of ult control there. And then her passive decreases the damage of ranged skills by 35%. So pretty nice kit to have there. And then this last unit is Red Zeldris. Red Zeldris does not allow you to gain ult gauge when you move skills, thanks to his commandment. He does have a single target drain, just like Cusack, and then he has an infect skill, which again can help stop Bond, since they will not be gaining, if they're able to get it off, the additional HP from his buff. Now, if you don't want to run Zeldris, you don't necessarily have to. This slot is a little flexible. I know some people will run Gother. Again, just like before, he stops Bond all on his own by preventing the use of buff skills. So he is a good pairing here. And I know some people like to run Nanashi. He is more of a off-meta support unit pick, I would say. His passive at the start of the ally's turn applies this interesting buff, max HP, crit resistance, and crit defense. And then it will reduce attacking enemies' ult gauge by 1 orb. So he's pretty much there for the passive. Obviously he's an unknown, so again he's not going to benefit from Cusack's passive. And then his kit is pretty mediocre. Doesn't really do anything else for the team. Now the team does have a mono red variant, which is meant to keep assault mode Meliodas in check. So that will run Red Zeldris. That in the past, if you did not run the Archangels team, ran Sariel. It ran Red Gallon because he did have buff removal, so that stopped Meliodas from stacking buffs. And then this also has a pretty flexible slot here. A lot of people, not Ram, I meant Rem. A lot of people would run Rem. She is a good, she's not technically a demon in the game, but she was another good DPS unit to run. Red Estarossa, I don't even think you can type red. Estarossa was another good unit to run here. We have a lot of commandments, so this is going to help proc Zeldris' passive, which scales off the amount of commandments in battle, not just on your team. So this also counts opposing commandments, and with the assault mode melee team, probably 2 to 3 commandments based on the comp. So you're looking at a very large, what is it, basic stat increase? Yep, for your team. The next team that we can look at is a potential unknown team. Now the unknowns haven't been really the best performing set of mono race teams to begin with. This also doesn't necessarily have to be mono race or be for the mono buffer only, but something like Lolly Merlin for her main damage, Gother for his restrictive debuff, and then Ram to further boost unknown allies' outputs. You could potentially run Nanashi here since he is an unknown, and he would help with ult control, so probably something like this. This slot could also go to Lizhawk. As we saw, the summer version has the unknown line in her passive, which is a 10% decrease from single target attack skills. Much better on the goddess team, like I said, so I wouldn't particularly do this. Rem was also thrown in here together, but unknowns don't really have any particularly good synergy outside of just being a hodgepodge of unknowns. The team's usually very easy to play around, so this again would also probably be more like a last-ditch effort team. Next is a defense variant of the Bond team. Now I wouldn't recommend this to anyone outside of the mono buffer, but even then, thanks to Bond's playstyle, he is much better suited on offense. But if you had to run him on defense, it would look something like this. Obviously, you need Bond and Arthur together. Then you have your 2 flex slots. This could be Kyo, since he's not really going to be on the debuff team as the mono buffer. And then you also have Athena to help stop suicide. This could also be Tweegoed, who further boost our HP. And then since we have Kyo, it also makes sense to run Red Lilia with her relic. Something like this, but like I mentioned, this isn't really the best option outside of mono buffing. And then, you know, even then isn't that great. Once you have your defenses finished, you are going to look into setting up your artifact cards. Now, they are not shared across teams, so you are going to need to have enough cards to accommodate all 5 of your defenses. And generally speaking, starting with fraudulent teams and Ludo teams, you'll just sort by combat class and auto set. The only exceptions are going to be the Bond team, where you'll obviously run HP artifact cards. And then any team that you want to run some of the more specific artifact sets. So with that in mind, the first one that you can really run is the increase starting grade R basic stats by 6% PvP. It's 6% for me since it's just level 1. I think it goes up to 10. This is really just used for Tweego. Again, in the Bond team, I probably wouldn't consider this since straight flat HP is probably better. Since this is only accommodating 1 unit, it's kind of a waste if that unit dies early due to some unforeseen circumstance, and the entire team can benefit from, you know, full HP. This does give some HP, but again, I probably wouldn't use an entire artifact set for just 1 unit. Next is Impending Doom. This is going to accommodate the 7 Catastrophe set, or the 7 Catastrophes team, as this increases their stats by 5%. This is excluded PvP, PvP, Brawl only. Now, there are a couple of these that specifically state PvP Fight Festival Elite. Guild Wars is technically Elite PvP. Some people think it works, some people think it doesn't. It's something that's pretty difficult to test, so if you know for 100%, let me know. But if this does work, then this would be a decent option. The next one is the New Year's set. Decrease 7 deadly sins allies damage taken from enemies by 2%. So you could use this in a team that runs, you know, one of the sins, such as the Debuff team if you're running Ragnarok Diane, any of the Trader Meliodas comps. If King is anywhere that's not on the Ludo team, T1 team, anything like that. Now, there is a Ragnarok set, Cold Winter Day. This is very, very specific, and it only applies to Ragnarok heroes. The only Ragnarok heroes that we're even using right now are Sigurd, and he is on attack. I know some people are testing Scotty, but I don't think Scotty has made any grounds yet, so this team, or this artifact set's probably not very good. You have the Valentine set, which increases HP-related stats of all allies with 10% HP or less by 10% for 1 turn. So again, very conditional. Doesn't happen all the time. Probably not the best to use. The Belmoth set, that's not going to work. This is the other PvP Fight Festival Elite team. This would work very well against teams that rush ult and suicide comps. So if that did work, that would be good. And then the only other one would be the increasing starting grade SR allies basic stats, but we don't even use any SR heroes, so that set is useless. Once you have finished setting up your artifacts, the last thing that we need to look at is setting up our buffs. So if you come to the Knighthood Manager, come down to level 3, you'll see that there is a buff for every substat in the game, and it is divided up by color. Now, similar to the substats of our gears, most of the stats are pretty useless except for attack, defense, HP, and pierce rate. Attack is pretty much going to be the primary one that I would use for every comp. I can't look at attack because I already have bought out all the attacks, but that is the main one that I would look at using for every team comp. And then the other 3 I would use in certain scenarios where there is a condition I would suppose that you are trying to meet. So for defense, its main condition is using it in conjunction with Tarmael, since he is pretty much the only unit that wants to scale off of defense. Buying 1 or 2 defense buffs, depending on your Tarm's defense, is something I would consider. The next is going to be your HP buffs. Now, this has 2 conditions. The first one is, for whatever reason you are running Bond on defense, obviously you're going to stack HP here. And the second is if you are afraid of going second. Now, as a defense team, it is very easy to out-CC your opponents, and you should be going first. However, if you are going to go second, and you know that, then there is a decent argument you could make to buy some HP buffs to make yourself go first. Now, how do you know that you're going to go second? Well, there is a certain CC threshold that you can sort of figure out based off your experience and how often you can play in Guild Wars. The highest CC that each team can hit. So obviously I would just look at the highest CC team, period, and then that will scale differently depending on the bracket you're in. So what I mean by that is, for example, in the top tier of Guild Wars, a lot of players have 10 mil box CC and 4th Constellation complete, one or the other, or even both. With both, I believe the glue team can hit around 293. So that's going to be my threshold. I'm going to want all of my defense teams to at least be 293 and above, either with or without buffs. If it's without buffs, then I'm in a good spot, because with buffs, we're probably pushing 295, 296. If it's with a buff, then, you know, that team's not going to hold up very well. If that is something that's going to be a common trend amongst all your teams, you know, you guys might not be in the right bracket. You might be a little higher than you need to be, and the rest of the guilds are just kind of give you a lot of trouble, or you are where you need to be and there's just a lot of room for improvement in your box. So that is something to consider. Now the last buff is going to be Pierce. Obviously this is only going to be run on the Pierce team just to further increase their damage output. Now, how do you actually buff the teams? Well, it's going to depend heavily on the team's overall color, and then also the team's DPS. So I'll make a mock team here. For example, we'll do the Ludolin team with King. So that team is going to be essentially half blue and half green. Now we do have a split here, and I'll just pick a random blue unit. Nope, actually I need green. We'll do Festival's Elders. So it looks something like this. You have your primary DPS on the right. We have a split between color composition. So I'm going to focus my buffs on my main DPS. So for example, King in this case, I'm going to do 2 blues and probably 1 green. So this is going to help boost the overall CC of the team by accommodating all of the units. And at the same time, King is going to benefit a little more from that extra attack boost. So even triple blue is something that you could consider. So it's very easy to buff a team that has one color in common if you can try to make your teams as monocolored as possible, but obviously not completely monocolored if you can avoid it. You know, it really depends on the comp, just because you don't want to get completely wrecked by type advantage. The only thing that can be troublesome is if you are buffing a team that hits pretty much every color. Now, I think the only real meta comp that's going to do that is the Disasters. So we'll take a look at that team specifically. That is going to be our Green Roxy and Green Mono, Blue Lilia, and Queen Easton. Now, if you do have a team that hits pretty much every color, there is still going to be one color that 2 units have in common. So in this case, I am going to accommodate green for these 2 ladies right here. Hit a double green attack, and then Blue Lilia is pretty much the secondary or offset DPS there. So I'd probably do a blue attack here. Again, I wouldn't run defense, wouldn't run HP because I'm not worried about my own CC. And then obviously Pierce doesn't need to be here. So attack is going to be the primary buff that we'll do there. Then you'll want to use that same concept, same idea across all your teams, and you will have your buffs set up. So that pretty much covers everything for defense teams. If I did forget something, let me know. But that is going to cover it. If you guys like to drop a thumbie, maybe sub if you're into that. I'll see you in the next one.